Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to Professor John Elson, who will introduce our first chair recipient.
When I think about Jim Haddad, I think about some wonderful evenings a few of us who are here present had sharing in the Passover celebration at the Haddad household. And I recall a child would voice a question, not that different from this.
Why on this day is the class of 1967 James B. Haddad Chair being awarded to Tom?
I will tell you, my child. Tom Geraghty was at the Northwestern Legal Clinic from its inception. For the last more than 40 years, he has administered it, has guided it, and has nourished it from an office that had 3 faculty and 15 students in 1968 to one that now has 30 faculty teaching in over 8 different live client clinics and to over 150 students. That would be sufficient. At a time when clinical education was in its infancy, Tom developed a vision of clinical education that has not only led our clinic here to national prominence, but has been a national model for law school clinics. That would be sufficient. Tom has not been content with making his vision of clinical education a national model. Rather, he has made it an international model by becoming one of and probably the most important American consultant on clinical legal education to law schools throughout Africa and Asia. And that would be sufficient. Over the last 3 decades, Tom has had a vision for how the practice of law in Cook County Juvenile Court must be improved and has implemented, along with his colleagues in our Children and Family Justice Center, a strategy that has gone very far in doing just that. And that would be sufficient. For the last 40 years, Tom has been an inspiring role model for our law students who want to follow in his path of using the law to help those who would otherwise be defenseless against the sometimes oppressive weight of law enforcement. I think it's symptomatic of Tom's influence in this regard that at the Spiff Award dinner last Thursday, where Tom was specially honored, many of the honorees and presenters talked as much about how Tom had been a major inspiration in their public interest work as they did about their own accomplishments. And that would be sufficient. I could go on for some time with more and more Dianus. I haven't even begun to talk about the legal victories Tom engineered or played a key role in litigating on behalf of innocent defendants, and his central role in the development of our incredibly successful Center on Wrongful Convictions. And Tom hasn't let up in the least. For example, today and for the last several days, and I think tomorrow, he's been at 26 in California litigating with his students some very difficult felony cases. And I haven't even mentioned Tom's plethora of publications. But I think you get the idea about why Tom more than deserves this chair. I will end with 2 thank yous. First, to the class of 1967 and the other alumni who in 1992 established this chair to honor Professor Haddad. Jim was a member of the class of 1967 who served on this law school's faculty from 1969 until his death in 1992. Jim was a classmate of mine in the 1964-1965 school year, when at the top of his class at University of Chicago Law, he transferred to Northwestern for what, no doubt, he hoped and found to be an environment more hospitable, perhaps more intellectually challenging, and clearly more engaged in the field of criminal law. I think my alma mater is still not recovered from that blow. There could not be a more appropriate holder of the Jim Haddad Chair than Tom, because Tom and Jim were close colleagues and friends, because Jim has been a lasting inspiration and model, not only for Tom, but for the rest of us in the clinic who worked with Jim, and because Tom has been a caring and devoted friend to Jim's family, Wendy, who I saw here earlier, Emma, and Abigail. Finally, a big thanks to Dean Rodriguez for approving this chair for Tom. Needless to say, we in the clinic are greatly heartened by this honor for our leader. Recognition of the important role clinical faculty, such as Tom, can and should play in the law school started at Northwestern in the 1970s. It perhaps became a little attenuated for a short period, 15 years, 3 months, and 12 days, but I think I speak for all of us in the clinical program that this great honor for Tom is a wonderful sign that the school is returning fully to its former path of enlightenment.
President Shapiro, Dean Rodriguez, and wonderful guests, faculty, of course. John and Bob, I was present at many of those events at Wendy and Jim's house, but I don't remember that particular exchange having taken place. Well, thank you for naming me the class of 1967 James B. Haddad Chair. It means a lot to me. Wendy Meltzer, Jim Haddad's wife, and members of the class of '67, I want you to know how honored and grateful I am to hold the chair in the name of Jim Haddad and the class of 1967. Thanks and my love to Diane and to my daughters Sarah, Annie, Catherine, and Miriam for supporting and encouraging me over the years. To the class of 1967 again, your affection for your classmate Jim Haddad and for this law school has been evident and so very impressive over the years. Thanks to all of you, and especially to Ed Dunn, for all that you did and have done to support the creation of the class of 1967 Haddad Chair, and for your many other acts of generosity that have been of such great benefit to the law school. Now, I'd like to say a few words about Jim Haddad, who was my friend and mentor. And these words are taken from a memorial that I wrote about Jim that was published in our Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology shortly after Jim's death in 1992. And I hope that these remarks will give you a sense of who Jim was and why he was so beloved by his family, his colleagues, his students, and by our profession. Jim Haddad led a life of teaching, scholarship, and service in which the underlying themes were fairness and compassion. He began his professional life as a prosecutor who worked in high-volume misdemeanor courts. He then joined the faculty of the Northwestern University School of Law, teaching criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence. After teaching for a short time, he was called back to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office to serve as First Assistant State's Attorney, a huge job. When he returned to teach in the law school after serving as First Assistant, he became one of our law school's best-loved teachers and a highly respected colleague and a productive scholar. At the same time that he was actively engaged in teaching and writing at the law school, he continued his involvement in the affairs of the criminal justice system by participating in continuing education programs for judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers, and by representing indigent criminal defendants. Jim was a wonderful teacher. I know because I often supervise students in our legal clinic whose interest in criminal law stemmed from taking one of Jim's classes. There are a number of reasons why students were so engaged by Jim's teaching. He knew how things worked in the courtroom. The casebook that he co-authored and used in his courses was a wonderful blend of comprehensive treatment of the subject matter, thoughtful organization, and insightful analysis. When after Jim's death I taught the remaining portion of his criminal procedure course, I could tell from the way in which his casebook was written and organized that his students were privileged to observe the workings of a truly well-organized and insightful mind. I also know from talking to his students that they found Jim's classes to be among the best they took in law school because Jim's analyses and criticisms of the material were always straightforward, rational, and fair-minded. Jim Haddad thought that our criminal justice system needed the involvement of scholar practitioners who addressed issues which arise in the day-to-day administration of justice and who are willing to develop teaching relationships with practitioners and judges. Jim also knew that knowledge in the absence of judgment is not enough. Good judgment always informs the highest use of knowledge. And Jim bridged the gap between scholar and practitioner. His scholarship, teaching, and professional activities brought the worlds of law teacher and lawyer together. Too few academics work with lawyers and judges on the system's mechanics. Too few law teachers participate in criminal litigation at the trial, appellate, and collateral stages. This is so even though the participation of legal academics in the administration and practice of criminal law would provide valuable perspectives to lawyers and judges on lawmaking, lawyering, and judging. The more active participation of law teachers in the affairs of the criminal justice system would also enhance the teaching and scholarship of academics, making even their most theoretical work more accessible and useful. As Jim believed, engagement of law teachers in the affairs of the criminal justice system would result in an important dialogue between practitioners and scholars about the reforms necessary to achieve fairness and efficiency. Jim's respect for the work of the many lawyers and judges who perform according to the highest professional standards did not blind him to the shortcomings of some members of our profession. He knew better than most the most devastating impact of corruption and incompetence on the justice system, on crime victims, and on clients. As one of our most able lawyers, he read trial records and listened to clients' descriptions of trial lawyers' shortcomings. Thus, he knew that many defendants received substandard representation, and he saw the impact that unprofessionalism had upon the lives of clients. The Operation Greylord scandal touched many he knew. He was not surprised by the results of the investigation, and from time to time, however, he was hurt when he learned that people that he had admired had proved to be corrupt. Jim spent much of his time helping prisoners by representing those he had the time to represent and seeking counsel for those he could not represent, and advising those for whom he cannot find legal representation. Well, why did he spend so much time working on behalf of people in prison? I never asked him that question directly, but I know that he thought our sentencing policies and practices resulted in sentences which were unnecessarily long and unfairly disparate. He knew that conditions in prisons were appalling. Not only do prisons isolate inmates for long periods of time from ordinary human contact, which ought to be punishment enough, he often said, our penal institutions punish more than should be permissible by permitting institutional violence. Jim thought at a bare minimum our criminal justice system should provide fair trials, rational, humane sentencing schemes, and penal institutions that protect human dignity. When he learned that he was seriously ill, Jim called upon friends and colleagues to take over his cases, perhaps one of the few favors that he ever asked. His first concern was that his clients be well represented during what we all hoped would be a brief absence from his active practice. The energy that he devoted to ensuring that his clients' interests were protected during a time when he was suffering from illness, the illness that eventually took his life, demonstrated the depth of his concern for those he represented. When he appeared in court to announce that his health required him to withdraw and that he had made arrangements for substitution of counsel, the judges and his opponents were visibly shaken and saddened. Jim's abilities and accomplishments were well known to everyone who worked with him, yet he was perhaps the most unassuming man I have ever known. He had absolutely no pretensions. He lived simply. For the most of his life, he didn't even have a car, and I was thinking last night, and Wendy, I think you can confirm this, that I taught him how to drive a car. That was one of the most terrifying experiences that I ever had. It was enough for him to enjoy his family and to help others through his teaching and scholarship and service. Jim left us too early. His work was far from complete. Had he lived longer, he would have continued to lead us all toward more just and humane solutions to the problems that beset us. Had he lived longer, we would still have the benefit of his irreplaceable advice and counsel. We can only hope that there will be other scholars, teachers, and lawyers who will live and work so effectively, so humanely, and so unselfishly. Thank you very much.